lemonade, and where I learned to skate on that front porch. It had a Z shape. It went around two sides of the house and then down a long L. It was wonderful for skating on, except you might skate down the front steps. I did ride tricycle there and learned to shoot a slingshot real well off that front porch. But mainly that front porch was for talking and for reading and for being with family. As was true in all small towns, there were a great many dogs in Thomasville where I grew up. Every family had a dog, and many of those dogs followed their owners to work in the morning and would lie down on the sidewalk outside the stores or go inside the stores and rest under the counters just to, I suppose, be where the action was. We had a dog named Sykes that used to trot behind my father when he'd go to his office and would lie out on the sidewalk and sometimes chase cars. I'm afraid Sykes was not the best trained dog. And there was Mr. Elliott Gunn, who had fine bird dogs. They used to ride in the car with him. He'd put two of them up on the front seat, his finest dogs, and they would sit there proud and looking around as if they owned that whole town. And Miss Gunn, Elliott's wife, would have to sit on the back seat because the dogs always sat on the front seat. And then I guess the best-known dog in Thomasville was Beans. Beans was a little black and white dog, part terrier, part feist. I don't know what kind of dog Beans was, short-haired, nice little dog. Belonged to Dozier Hardware. Dozier Hardware was on the corner, right downtown Thomasville, right near the drive to the right post and across the street from People's Drug Company. Beans would sit out there on the sidewalk and watch the comings and the goings. Beans had one peculiar habit. He was a hitchhiking dog. This was back in the days when automobiles had running boards. And customers to the hardware store down there would often find when they got home that Beans had ridden home with them. He'd just jump up on the running board when they got ready to leave the store and have him a little ride out to their house, and then they'd have to bring him back to the hardware. Well, one day, Beans was sitting out there on duty in front of Dozier Hardware Company, and a traveling salesman came by who was selling goods to the store. He completed his business and got in his car and driving towards Selma. Stopped about 20 miles from Thomasville, a little community of Lamison. And he got out and went in a store there, a combination filling station and store. Somebody said to him, where'd you get that dog? And he said, I don't have a dog. They said, well, yes, you do. That little dog right there came with you. And the traveling man said, no, I don't have a dog. I never saw that dog before. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, nobody in Lamson had ever seen the little dog either. And so Beans sat around there at the store for a while and looked as if he were expecting some friends to come by. And after a while, they did. Strangely enough, there were people from Thomasville who'd been up to Selma shopping and happened to stop at this little filling station in Lamison to buy some gasoline. And one of them looked over there and said, well, that looks like Beans sitting over there. Everybody in Thomasville knew Beans. Said, I don't know what he's doing up here, but let's see if it's Beans. And they called, here, Beans, here, Beans. Beans came trotting over just as happy as he could be to see somebody from home. So Beans hopped up on their running board and rode the 20 miles back to Thomasville. Just as happy a little hitchhiking dog as anybody ever saw. When I was growing up, one of my playmates was my cousin, Robert Tyson. Now, Robert was a little older than I was, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. he was a little blonde boy and very smart and somehow a great tease and often in a great deal of trouble. But his mother and my mother were friends in the Missionary Society, the Woman's Missionary Society in the Methodist Church in Thomasville. So when the Missionary Society met, it was usually arranged that Robert and I would play together during the Missionary Society meetings. They met in circles most of the time. Well, one afternoon, the circle was meeting at our house, and Robert was there. Well, our house had a long L built onto it, and about 4 bedrooms down that L, and on the end of the L was a storage room, dark and, not too pleasant looking, even in the best of times. Never knew what might be in that old, dark storage room. Well, Robert and I played on the porch there, riding tricycles and playing hopscotch even on the porch, and we were getting along pretty well, but Robert all of a sudden grabbed me and threw me into that closet and said to me, "King Tut is going to get you." Well, I didn't know who King Tut was. I was about 4 or 5 years old, but it seemed terrible fate for any child. And I screamed with a scream that broke up that Missionary Society meeting. Women came from all directions running to see what Robert had done to me, and by that time Robert had disappeared. But I've always been interested in King Tut. Back in the 1920s, early part of the 1920s, the shimmy was a very popular dance. It was the age of the flapper and new freedoms and new wildness. In came this dance, the shimmy. Now, in small towns, such as Thomasville, Alabama, where I grew up, the shimmy was frowned upon. It was even denounced from pulpits. It was a sinful dance. Well, I was maybe 3 years old, and unbeknownst to my parents, my good friend and our cook, Thurza, taught me how to shimmy. We'd be in the kitchen by ourselves while Thurza was cooking, and she'd show me how to do that hip-swaying shimmy dance. And she took me down to her house where her husband, Alec, played the fiddle. And Alec would fiddle and I would shimmy and Thurza would clap her hands in time to the music, and we would have a fine time. Well, one Sunday at our Methodist church there in Thomasville, we had a special guest, a musician from Birmingham, a woman named Miss Estelle Cake, who was visiting in town. She was going to provide music for the 11 o'clock service. Now, the only music that I had ever heard in church was the upright piano that Estelle Cake's sister-in-law, Miss Annie Cake, played. And Miss Annie was one fine musician. She could play any kind of music, and she excelled at church music and played that old out-of-tune upright piano beautifully. That piano always had a bowl of flowers up on top of it, zinnias all summer long that came out of Miss Mackey's garden. And I remember how they used to shake when Miss Annie would play the piano the way she liked to play it. But on this particular Sunday, I was a little girl about 3 years old sitting with my mother and father, and all of a sudden, Miss Annie began to play the piano, and this strange woman I had never seen before stood up and began to play the violin, which I knew only as a fiddle. And no sooner had she begun to play the first notes than I jumped up on that bench between